Kena Bridge of Spirits is out and the game has gathered some serious praise, and a great deal of that is due to its visuals, which we're also quite enamored with here at Digital Foundry. So in today's video, I will be going over this game's visuals, primary differences between the three versions of PS4 Pro, PS5, and PC, as well as look at the performance characteristics of the console versions, and offer some settings and performance considerations you need to look out for on PC. A lot to cover, so let's get started. What does make Kena Bridge of Spirits so visually enticing? On a technical level, I think I'm seeing a lot here that I already see in a lot of other Unreal Engine releases. Not too much added in terms of tech here. Rather, the game's visual execution with the engine feature set is what sets it apart. First, you have the assets in the game, the models, which have an incredible consistency in their art style and construction. Every object, every texture, every material seems to have been authored with an extremely consistent art style, polygon budget, and an understanding of what edges need to be rounded and which do not. When you look at a scene of all of the objects together, they fit together well, and you rarely find an object that will stick out as being inconsistently low resolution or modeled in an inconsistent way. The objects gel together to create consistent background, geometry, and scenery. Then you have character expressions and animation. Ember Lab previously worked on animated short films for products, advertisement, fan films, and more. That flourish for offline animated quality shows up in the game here. The basic movement animation, or the combat moves, or even jumping have a certain flair to them. You also have the interactions and animations between the Rot and Kena, which are all so cute and lovingly crafted. Then there's this secondary movement, as I'll call it. For example, when you tap your shield to let it explode, bits in the environment like plants and more will jiggle around. Or when your shield gets hit itself, it reverberates in waves, like a liquid surface. That looks especially neat. Tying this all together is the game's usage of long shutter speed per object motion blur that accentuates each of the handcrafted animations. Not everything's perfect, mind you, regarding animation, as I think animation transitions tend to be rather abrupt, and the base locomotion definitely seems to have a minor hitch in it regarding the camera and animation, but in general, the game's animation is a joy to look at. With that being said, how do the versions stack up visually? Let's start with PS4 Pro. Here there's only one mode that targets 30 FPS and 1440p. Dynamic resolution is in play, and that can perhaps go down to 1080p, but the lowest count I got was around 1188p with a good amount of 1296p and a lot of 1440p counts. The game just tends to look like 1440p here. In comparison to PlayStation 5 in performance mode, PS4 Pro has pared back vegetation density. Object LODs are also lower, so things can be missing at a distance or less detailed. Shadow resolution is also pared back, making shadows less defined and a bit smudgy. PS4 Pro also gets rid of signed distance field ambient occlusion, which the game uses extensively to aid its lighting. Like you can see here under the roof, where on PS5, under the roof is darkened away from that skylight, where on PlayStation 4 Pro, it is kind of glowing. PlayStation 5 uses extra CPU and GPU for two different modes. The first is performance mode with a 60 FPS target, outputting 4K and being reconstructed by temporal anti-aliasing upsampling. The general internal resolution I found is between 1296p and 1440p, but the further you get into the game, as areas become more complex, the more you will see that 1296p number popping up. For example, in the Village Hub, in this area, we can see PlayStation 5 being 1296p, where in that same area, PS4 Pro is 1440p. The general image quality is okay, but it doesn't look very 4K-like, especially if you put it next to what a real 4K tends to look like at normal viewing distances. Interestingly, compared to the PC version at the same internal resolution with that same upsampling on, the PlayStation 5 version in performance mode looks to be filtered differently. So here, in a cutscene where it's 1296p on one side and 1296p on the other on PC, PS5 looks softer for a reason I cannot really fathom. Next to this, you have the choice of quality mode on PlayStation 5, which targets 30 FPS, outputting 4K with TAAU once again. Dynamic res seems to be used here, with my counting 1944p at its worst, but in general, most of the shots that I counted were actually just native 4K. For example, this shot here in the village is a native 4K in quality mode, where it is 1296p in performance mode. On top of higher res, the quality mode also offers greater plant density than the performance mode, which is an awesome addition as I see it. Being an Unreal Engine game, the PC version here essentially allows you to push things a bit further. You can push shadow quality above that on PlayStation 5, where PS5 in both modes is using the high shadow quality. Texture quality can be increased, as PlayStation 5 seems to be using the low setting for textures for a variety of textures in the game. Similarly, anisotropic filtering can be increased, which also seems to be most similar to the low setting on PC. On PC, you can also increase volumetric fog quality, where PlayStation 5 looks to be around medium or low, but it's honestly a bit hard to tell considering how aliased it is in general. Beyond that, there are only smaller improvements on PC. And in fact, there are disadvantages on PC visually, as the game does not default use temporal anti-aliasing upsampling like it does on PlayStation 5. To enable that, you have to edit the game's engine.ini file located in this folder here. With that set, the game's resolution scaler will now use TAAU instead of basic spatial upscaler. Beyond this, I found some other quirks in the graphics menu. For example, turning volumetric fog to medium turns off signed distant field AO for some reason. I'm really not sure why, so the PC version definitely seems a little bit less polished in its graphical settings menu. Coming over to performance, let's start with the PlayStation 4 Pro. This version I spent the least amount of time with, so it's less representative, but even in that time, I found it to be an extremely solid 30 FPS. When using the PC version as a base to look for areas where I knew it was heavy, I could see that PlayStation 4 Pro was holding onto 30 FPS rather wonderfully. Big explosions, transformations, and traversing across the terrain, yeah, that was basically all 30 FPS. No issues in sight. The only issue I noticed is that you may see some ever so slight dips in cutscenes, but it's not an issue, I believe. The one issue I did notice on PS4 Pro is the streaming can lag behind if you move too quickly. For example, normally in this area, like I'm showing on PlayStation 5, you enter this area and you see this pot that you can command your rot to move to complete a small puzzle. When I went to this area on PS4 Pro, the pot was missing, even while I was looking around for it for a while. Only after I ran back and forth to the area did the pot finally stream in. So this is something that can happen on this platform. PlayStation 5, let's start with that 30 FPS mode, which is simple. This mode is a straight 30 FPS. I did not record any drops from that 30. The game is just unencumbered on the CPU side with 30 FPS lock, and DRS being there to help the GPU make sure it will be perfect should things ever get hairy. I did not see any issues. And that's really all there is to say about that. The 60 FPS mode is a slightly different story. In general, I would say it is good. You will have a good number of moments at an uninterrupted 60, but it does have its drops, some of which are more annoying than others. Less annoying ones are like those that occur when big things happen on screen, like an explosion or a bit of effects work. Here the game is already at its lowest res possible, I believe, and performance gives way instead of resolution, but I didn't find this hampering the gameplay too much. One that was slightly more annoying were those drops that happen in real-time cutscenes, which seem to be the norm. This only affects the fluidity in cutscenes and is not a gameplay concern, but it just makes the game seem a little bit less polished in such moments. The drops that did impact my enjoyment in this performance mode were those that I think are linked to traversal loading, which occurs when running around and in between game areas. Here the game just kind of drops frames when you run around, which can make progressing into this game's ever-widening world seem a bit fidgety as frames drop when you move around the game world. This reminds me of a lot of other loading issues we've seen in other Unreal Engine titles in the past. Speaking of hitching, let's come to that PC version. Now here this is not a full PC vid, so I will not do my usual super hardcore breakdown, but I will give you my optimized settings. PS5 settings, in my opinion, are a good starting point, but you can also make other changes like using high depth of field, medium motion blur, low ambient occlusion, and high shadows like we see on PS5. After this, there's the question of whether you should use DX11 or DX12. Altogether, these optimized settings on an RTX 2060 Super, Ryzen 5 3600 at 1440p being upscaled to 4K with TAAU, we can see a near 30% performance improvement in this scene here by utilizing optimized settings. After this, there's the question of whether you should use DX11 or DX12. DX11 tends to be better in GPU limited scenarios like this cutscene here, where DX11 runs 12% faster. But in the gameplay, DX12 is by far preferred as draw calls are ramped up and scene complexity grows, and DX12 holds up a lot better. Here we can see DX12 is a great deal faster overall. DX12 has a lot less frame time issues than we see in DX11, like we can also see in that PlayStation 5 version in performance mode when traversing. And the DX11 version just has that in spades. Like here, look at the frame time graph in DX11 here. It's really bad. With a frame time cap, all that unsteadiness turns to frame rate drops, like we see on PlayStation 5 in its performance mode, but honestly even more so. DX12 makes it so that this does not happen as often since it's smoothing those frame times out, but I still think DX12 is imperfect. For example, going into a new area with DX11 causes huge drops in excess of 66 milliseconds or longer. With DX12, the drop can still occur, it just happens for a much shorter duration. That is my general issue with this PC version. DX11 stutters to the point of being unusable, I would say, while DX12 is much better but still has issues. The game also seems to have shader compilation issues when effects come on screen. Like you can just be having normal gameplay at a smooth FPS, and all of a sudden an effect comes on screen and the game screeches to a halt as it stutters wildly. This is an issue we've seen in other Unreal Engine 4 games, and I find it a real shame to find it here. Other devs have managed to sort this out on Unreal Engine 4, like the Coalition and its Gears of War games, or Sony Bend with Days Gone. Or we even recently saw Neon Giant Games largely fix this issue in a patch for the Ascent. So it is doable, it's just that Ember Lab needs to figure it out. Another issue that affects every version of Kena Bridge of Spirits are the pre-rendered cutscenes. For some reason, the game's pre-rendered cutscenes are 24 FPS video files. As seasoned Digital Foundry viewers will know, 24 does not divide evenly into 60, the normal refresh rate of televisions and monitors. 24 FPS looks fine in a cinema on a projector where the refresh rates match the film frame rate, but it looks rather awful in real-time 3D rendering on modern screens. So as cute and as well crafted as these pre-rendered cutscenes are, and there are quite a number of them in this game, they look pretty bad in motion. I hope the devs look to re-render these video files out at 30 or 60 FPS for the various modes for future updates. To end this performance section on a positive note though, I can report that all versions of the game have very low loading times. Even the PlayStation 4 Pro professionally handles them with little downtime between action. This is not the norm on that gen of consoles and is definitely praiseworthy. Coming to the end here with Kena, I think it's a really good looking game. The PS4 Pro version is solid. PS5 is also pretty great, but there on PS5 we can start seeing engine issues, I believe, when targeting 60 FPS, and those issues are manifested greatest on the PC side of things. And hopefully that can be fixed so the PC version is in a place that I find good, and the PlayStation 5 performance mode becomes even smoother. Until then, I hope you liked this video. If you did like it, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you're already a subscriber, hit that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry posts a video. If you want to help us out, support DF on Patreon to get years worth of our content available in high quality for download. If you want to talk to me about this game, write a comment below or follow me on Twitter. And as always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.